Hello there. Welcome back to my ongoing attempt to review every single game ever on Steam Deck. For those of you that didn't see my last video, where I took a look at all of the Silent Hill games running on Deck, essentially the goal of this series is to showcase the unique capabilities of handheld gaming PCs. To do that, in this episode we're going to test every single version of every single Siren game on the Steam Deck. For those of you that are new to the series, here's how it works. Via emulation, I test every port of each game released across both console and PC and record footage of them via capture card. Based on my own subjective experience, I then give each port a compatibility score out of 10 and issue a final recommendation on which one you should play on Steam Deck. In order for a port to get top marks, it needs to run at its full intended frame rate and feature no major graphical issues. Additionally, each port needs to render at the Deck's native resolution. I'll also be giving each game a little review as we go along. It's like a bonus. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of each episode of this series, these videos take a lot of time to put together. With that in mind, I want them to be a service to you. If you like what I'm doing here, please do give the video a like and maybe even subscribe. If you have a particular franchise that you'd like to see tested on the Deck, pause the video and let me know in the comments. Oh, and as always, I will only be testing through SteamOS, as that's what the vast majority of users are rocking on their Deck. Alright, on to the games. At the tail end of my last episode, I mentioned that the next series I'd cover had more than a couple of distinct links to Silent Hill, and believe it or not, that wasn't just me talking directly out of my trumpet. After the release of Silent Hill 1, that game's director, Koichiro Toyama, left Konami and joined Sony along with two other members of Team Silent, monster designer Naoko Sato and background artist Isao Takahashi. After a couple of years getting acclimated to life over in PlayStation land, Koichiro formed Project Siren with his two former colleagues. Naoko would serve as writer for the team's 3-game run, and Isao would take up the mantle of art director at the studio. Their first game was, well, this one, Siren, which was released for the PS2 in Japan in 2003. It would reach Europe and the US 1 year later in 2004. Structurally, Siren is probably the most unique game I've played this year. Over the course of the game's story, you play as 10 different protagonists who've all arrived at the fictional Japanese village of Haneda for completely different reasons. If there's one direct line you could draw from Silent Hill over to Siren, it's the shared focus on setting that serves as a central foundation for the game's story. Siren's setting of Haneda is just as esteemed as Silent Hill, and it carries a texture and atmosphere that really cements the game's tone. Instead of traversing a persistent and open environment, Siren is split up into bite-sized levels bookended by cutscenes, so very traditional in that sense. The primary obstacle you'll face throughout each of these chapters are the Shibito, residents of Haneda village who've been possessed by a malevolent force. Siren's gameplay draws more inspiration from games like Clock Tower than it does from Silent Hill or Resi, so you'll be doing far more running, hiding and sneaking than you will fighting, shooting or slicing. The main tool you have at your disposal is sight jacking, a feature that is hands down the most unique thing about Siren, despite the game already being steeped in uniqueness. By pressing L2, your screen is bathed in static, at which point you tilt the analog stick in the direction of a Shibito so that you can see through their eyes. This is how you'll outwit enemies in Siren. It's scary, it's analog, and it's incredibly engaging, even by today's standards. So a home run then, right? Well, not exactly. Siren is a lot of things. It's visually unique, thematically brilliant, but it's also mired in old school frustrations that really hamper the overall experience. The game's difficulty spikes would make even the most seasoned adventure game aficionado drop his floppy disks in shock. Siren is one of the hardest and most esoteric games I've ever played in my entire life. It isn't for the faint of heart, and not just because it's scary. Reddit user Red13k shared an anecdote that kinda sums up Siren's difficulty, where they had to, and I quote, put a wet towel in a freezer during one chapter so that a couple of chapters later another character could take the towel, put a glass on it, and then wait for it to melt so that the glass would drop and distract a guard. You know what I'm getting at here? Anyway, our primary interest is in seeing how well the game performs on Steam Deck. I'm running the game via PC SX2 within SteamOS 3.5. Many of the issues that tend to plague PS2 games played via this emulator are thankfully absent in this case. PC SX2 has a tendency to struggle with complex post-processing effects at times. However, in Siren's case, the game's foggy, staticky, analog atmosphere is reproduced perfectly. The emulator's upscaling really shines in this case. The de-interlacing patch that PCSX2 auto-magically applies to the game really benefits Siren's overall image quality. When you emulate games like this, there's always a balance to be maintained between crisp modern output and grungy lo-fi aesthetics. We're walking that line with ease here. I did run into one issue with Siren whenever I tried saving and loading data. Save states worked as intended, however, when trying to save and load within the game itself, it would act as though I had no memory card inserted. The only way I could resolve this issue was by switching PCSX2's built-in memory card emulator over to the folder option. The game then behaved itself moving forward. Those of you who've watched this channel before will know that I tend to rag on PCSX2 for having much higher input latency than its generational cohorts like Dolphin and Zemu. That latency is obviously still here in Siren's case, however, it doesn't really impact the game at all, as it's a slow-paced horror adventure and not a twitchy arcade racer. Audio is very strong, with no egregious issues affecting playback. I did notice some minor popping and crackling here and there, but again, it's a poppy and crackly sounding game in general, so no big deal really. Performance is essentially perfect, as you can no doubt see by the footage. Switching perspectives between protagonists and Shibito, traversing each level, shooting your allies. I rarely encountered anything that taxed PCSX2 enough to drop frames. Providing that you like the game to begin with, Siren is an absolutely fantastic experience on deck, and definitely one of the best I've tested within PCSX2. Perfect performance, excellent presentation, and only a minor memory card related blip to tarnish my time with the game. Siren, for the PlayStation 2, scores a compatibility rating of 10 out of 10 on Steam Deck. The next title in the Siren trilogy would see Sony's Japan studio and the Project Siren team promptly address many of the criticisms levelled at the original game. Forbidden Siren 2 released for the PlayStation 2 in Japan, Australia and Europe in 2006, right at the tail end of the console's life cycle, with no US release to speak of. Structurally, the game follows a very similar format to its predecessor. You play as a brand new gaggle of protagonists and work your way through a non-linear story that builds your familiarity with the game's world in a fractured and mysterious way. Thankfully, Siren 2 is an easier game than the original. Alongside the returning Sight Jack ability, you now have melee attacks, greater mobility, and more weapons to use against the Shibito. You're not just running away this time, you're also fighting back. Alongside the Shibito, you'll also encounter the Yamabito, a new enemy type with a sensitivity to light. These enemies are smarter, tougher, and I'd argue a damn sight scarier than your garden variety Shibito. They're a nice counter to the improved toolset you have as any of the game's protagonists. Despite all of its improvements, Siren 2 is a pretty divisive sequel. Criticism is often levelled at the game's narrative, which isn't relayed as eloquently as it was in Siren 1. It's a little bit harder to keep track of who's who and why they're doing what they're doing. Missions are also shorter this time around and are a little more straightforward too. Thanks to this streamlining, you may find yourself less invested in the game's events. Mechanically, structurally, Siren 2 is superior to the original game. Conceptually, however, it lags behind. Still scary, still great, just a little more plain. Checking the game out on Steam Deck, and we're running it through PCSX2 and via SteamOS 3.5. Seeing as Siren 2 never received a US release, we're stuck with the PAL version of the game, which only runs at half of 50 Hz, or 25 FPS if you want to get mathematical about the whole thing. If you're playing on the deck's built-in display, knocking the refresh rate back to 50 Hz will result in a smooth and evenly frame-paced image. If you play on an external display at 60 Hz, however, do note that the game will stutter as a result of the game's frame rate not dividing evenly into the display's refresh rate. The only significant issue I encountered when playing Siren 2 on deck were these black vertical bars that appeared on screen during the intro. I've seen reports online that these bars reappear at set moments throughout the story, however, I didn't see them again during my playthrough. Audio is essentially perfect, the game sounds great and tends to eschew the use of a traditional soundtrack in favour of creepy ambient sound effects, and they're relayed here in suitably spooky fashion. Moving on to controller response, and of course I'm going to mention PCSX2's input lag. It's present for Siren 2, however, the game feels more responsive than its forebear, and the issue is less obvious this time around. This game's greater focus on combat and action certainly benefits from the increased snappiness. Despite falling short of a perfect score thanks to its PAL refresh rate and intermittent black bars, Siren 2 is still a great experience on deck, especially if you're playing on the handheld's built-in display. Siren 2 scores a compatibility rating of 9 out of 10. Those of you that have watched some of my older videos will know that I'm not a massive fan of remakes. In the vast majority of cases, I think they're safe, plodding exercises in miserly penny pinching that really highlight the lack of creativity in the AAA space at present. After the release of Siren 2, Japan Studio and Project Siren only bloody went and remade the original game in the series for PS3, releasing it episodically in 2008. Many Japanese properties, be they manga, movie, anime or game, have received Western remakes made by Western studios. Blood Curse is a Western remake, however it was helmed by the original game's creators, so it occupies a very unique space in that regard. Almost every main character in Blood Curse has been recast as an American equivalent, for better and for worse. I'd like to think that the uniquely Japanese perspective and characterization of the original game's cast were and still are a huge plus point, especially when coupled with the groundbreaking way that character models were rendered in Sirens 1 and 2. This time around, the roster of protagonists both look and feel just that bit more generic, despite the fact that the game is just as Japanese as its predecessors. It's a game from 2008 that looks and plays like a game from 2008. Project Siren's prior attempts to streamline the series and ease up accessibility have been kicked into high gear for Siren Blood Curse. This is a very friendly game and not a particularly difficult one. The sight jacking ability that headlined Siren 1 and 2 feels excess to requirement in this game. I never really felt the need to use it beyond a handful of occasions throughout the story. Speaking of that story, it's now far more straightforward than before. I feel like this may have been a knee-jerk reaction to Siren 2's oft incomprehensible narrative, but I feel like it was an overcorrection. Siren 1 already had an excellent story, and there was no need to compromise it for the remake. On the whole, I think Siren Blood Curse is actually a better overall experience than the original game. It's easier, less esoteric, doesn't feature enemies that can literally no-scope you from across the map, and it's a digestible entry point for the series. Having said that, it's difficult for me not to feel as though the series lost a lot of its charm in getting to this point, especially when it comes to visual design. Anyway, we have a very important question to answer. Can we play the game on Steam Deck? The short answer here is no. Running the game via RPCS 3 on SteamOS 3.5, and we actually get some pretty decent performance right out of the gate, and visually, the game seems to hold up well. The real issue here begins once you're grappled by an enemy. Once you've been grabbed, the game requires you to shake the PS3's 6-axis controller in order to break free. RPCS 3 supports the gyro controls of the DualShock 3 and 4 controllers, however it doesn't feature a way to emulate those controls on other devices, like the Steam Deck. This means that we have a perfectly good and usable gyro within Valve's handheld that is completely unsupported within RPCS 3. And with no way to turn gyro controls off within Siren Blood Curse, the game is essentially unplayable unless you pair a PS3 or PS4 controller to your deck. Here's hoping that RPCS 3 advances to the point of being able to emulate gyro controls on more modern controllers. However, for the time being, the emulator's shortcomings result in Siren Blood Curse scoring a 3 out of 10 for compatibility on Steam Deck. And with that, we've covered them all. Siren's time in the spotlight was brief, but uniquely brilliant. Each entry in the series has something special to offer you, unless of course you're trying to play the third game on Steam Deck. The game's creator, Keiichiro Toyama, eventually left Sony to form Bokeh Game Company. Their inaugural title, Slitterhead, was announced in 2021, so thankfully there's more to come from the man who gave us both Silent Hill and Siren. As for me, I'll be back with you very shortly to test and review a series that was as grisly as it was controversial. See ya!